All right, Mr. Nathan Lewis, welcome back to the Supply Side Podcast. Thanks again for making time for us.
Great to be here.
Well, I'm stoked to have you back because you've now made a great decision to get your new letter, the Polaris letter, onto Substack. And I'm a big fan of Substack. If listeners aren't familiar with it, it's a great way for writers, for anybody with a great story to tell, to get some to get a good audience and to get paid for it. So we're going to make sure we send people to the new letter. But as I said to you a moment ago, there was a couple of things that you wrote in the last one that had me literally laughing out loud. And I'll do those quickly. My personal favorite was when you talked about the Japanese finance minister in 1936 suggesting to the army that they needed to cut spending, and he got executed. I'd just be
He
interesting to
probably didn't
see
think
if
it was that funny,
no, he didn't.
but it's
But
true.
I read it thinking about if somebody tried to suggest to government that maybe stopping spending would be a good idea. At this stage of history, it doesn't seem that would go down too well. And my other favorite was near the end of the letter. You gave a great definition of MMT, where you said MMT is an open-ended excuse for the government to print money for whatever it might like to spend money on, which will doubtless be very popular until it's not. I like that. I like that turn of phrase because when the party's on, it's very popular, and until it's not. So I like
Yeah.
those. And what I want to do is give you a little introductory quote of yours here, just to lead us off. The letter begins where you have this great comment about assets being overpriced, bond yields are down, but you had this quote here where you say, "We are in the early stages of a monetary event worldwide that will probably result in 80% real losses in stocks, bonds, and cash over a period of 5 to 8 years. And the essence of this event is a decline in currencies worldwide, and there's no refuge in any particular currency." And the last thing I'll say on the intro is that you said we haven't really seen anything like this since about the 1780s, around the Continental Congress. So, as you would agree, an 80% real loss is a big statement. Tell us what you're thinking.
Well, it's real simple. If bonds can't really go up in value, right? They're already real expensive. They could actually. You could have negative interest rates, but it might be kind of a temporary thing. Stocks, typically, the valuations are very high, and if you had enough debasement of the currency, the stocks could go up a lot. But typically, after their valuations have already gone down a lot, does that make any sense? They become cheap, and then they start to rise due to inflationary reasons. So you're not going to get any nominal. It's almost impossible to get substantial nominal increases in, at least in the U.S. accent market. Some you can make an argument about Taiwan or something. I don't know, some foreign market. But then if your currency loses value, and 80% decline, so it's only worth 1/5 as much as it is today. Then your real losses are as 80% loss, right? And that's that's very easy to achieve. We've already done it twice, just in relatively recent U.S. history. During the 1970s, the value of the dollar went from it took $35 to buy an ounce of gold in 1970. This gold standard system. It was set up so the dollar would stabilize. It was always 35, right? It didn't fall in value. Then you had these events, and we began the floating fiat currency system in 1971, 1973, that period. And by the time all the smoke cleared, it took about $350 to buy an ounce of gold. So it's basically a 10-to-1 decline. The dollar of the 1980s was worth 10 cents in the 1960s. So when I say 5-to-1, 80% decline, it's actually kind of modest compared to what we've already done. And then in the 2001 to 2011 period, went from about 350, kind of that average during the 80s and 90s, to about, well, we kind of stabilized around 1250 for a while, but we touched 1800, 1900. So 5 times 350 is 1750. So is that right? Yes. So again, that's about a 5-to-1 decline. So this is stuff we've done, and to say that it could happen again it shouldn't be very surprising. And also to say that it could happen when we are, I would say, some of the most extreme fiscal and monetary situation, and just this loss of discipline in all aspects of the political system. It seems like a pretty easy call to me.
It's a really interesting point when you talk about the loss of discipline. I reached out to Chris DeMuth, who's at the Hudson Institute, and he wrote two pieces in the Wall Street Journal the last few days, and his piece on deficit spending was, I think, quite brilliant. And I'll put some links to that in the show notes. But this is incredible data. He said that for 181 years, the US government ran basic, balanced budgets for 181 years with some small variance. And then the data that he shows, like, I just looked at it, and this kind of, this immersion in deficit spending. And in your letter, I just want to find this. You talked about, you had some great quotes from, from the French experience, I think in the 1790s, from Andrew Dixon White's book. And, you said here, the National Assembly had from the first shown an amazing liberality to all sorts of enterprises, wise or foolish, which were urged for, and here's the key thing, for the good of the people. So I'm looking at the stimulus in the US at the moment. Is it just the same thing? Is it just, Chris DeMuth says that there is a fundamental shift in our political economy now, right? We're promising huge amounts of transfer payments to individuals, drawing future prosperity. When does it stop? I mean, is this really different simply in terms of scale?
Yeah, it clearly, I mean, everyone has realized that something's going on. They're just not quite sure what the consequences are, right? Because we haven't seen it before. And so far, it seems like it's been nothing. It's been party time, right? We kind of did it last year, handed all these checks, ran these 15% of GDP deficits. We're doing it again this year. And it's not easy to say anything particularly bad has happened. I mean, we've had by many measures the sharpest recession since the Great Depression, right? 2020. At the same, but due to these government handouts, personal income actually went up. Yeah, it's never happened in a recession before, because of the checks in the mail, right? And then with the most recent round of handouts early this year, personal income soared again to made an even bigger spike higher, and which we've never really seen before, right? I mean, just blasting money out like that. Well, you could argue that it was a unintended consequence of World War II, because at that time they were spending money to buy bombers and stuff. But it was the last time we saw anything like that happen. And here we are, just sitting around at home watching TV, right? We're not really fighting World War II here. It's just weird, and I think that I think when you read that account of France, and there's so many similarities. It took me all of like 8 minutes to find 5 or 6 similarities that they listed there. There are so many, I could hardly stop cutting and pasting. These accounts of the political process and the psychological process. By what thinking process did we end up with a 15% of GDP deficit, not just once but twice, 2 years in a row, and already there's like a 10% of GDP deficit baked into the cake for the third year, but it's just because they passed these spending bills, but the actual money doesn't go out the door until the next fiscal year. So there's a lot baked in even for 2022. I think it's about 8 or 10%. And it's crazy.
And going back to your earlier books, like, it seems that if there's any sort of tax policy from the current administration, it's a kind of soak the rich tax policy. And having read your books, like, you're unequivocal that what we're looking for is low taxes and stable money. But what we're going to get is, as these taxes go through the ceiling, you actually get less revenue, right?
Yeah. That's another thing that's happening now. And some of these tax increases are pretty big. There's an increase in corporate tax, kind of undoing, half undoing the Trump stuff. That in itself is maybe not such a big deal. But now they're talking about, applying, I don't know if you know the complexities of the U.S. tax code, but payroll tax.
Does anyone know the complexities of the U.S. tax code?
No, they don't. But some of these weird, one complicated thing piled up on another. They're talking about applying payroll taxes now to higher incomes, which is essentially, stacking on top of the income tax. But it's actually worse because payroll tax, there's no deductions against it, right? In income taxes, there's often ways to not have income taxed. And then even placing that, now talking about capital gains rates that are in excess of 50% in some states, and then taxes going up at the state level, and la-di-da-di-da. And these are some pretty big moves. They're probably not going to generate any revenue, and they're going to have some meaningful economic slowdown effect, I think. So then you get the triple whammy, which I think there's three ways you get whammied, which I talked about in the magic formula. So you don't really get any extra revenue. In the last 70 years, U.S. history, no tax increase, legislated tax increase has created any revenue, sustainable increase in the revenue GDP ratio. No tax reduction has created a sustained decline. So, they spent the money thinking they're going to counterbalance it with revenue, but there is no revenue. So they just have a bigger deficit. It's basically what happens, right? Well, what do they do when they have the bigger deficit? Well, they're going to print the money, but they also might raise taxes some more. The next thing that happens is, GDP slows down. So your revenue GDP ratio is maybe it's unchanged, but GDP is smaller because there's fewer people working and they're getting paid less. That's basically what GDP is, right? Yeah. So your tax revenue is down, right? Instead of going up. And another thing that happens is often you might be in more of a recessionary situation, and actually in a recession, more of like a cyclical recession, the revenue GDP ratio tends to decline because people are out of work, kind of changing jobs and stuff. So it's just one way after the other, right? Revenue actually tends to decline relative to what it would, not necessarily decline in nominal terms, because there's kind of an upward trend to everything, but be lower than it would be if there had been no change in policy at all. But at the same time, they're matching this with more spending.
And there's a demographic issue as well, right? There's a demographic issue as well.
Yeah, somewhat. It's kind of that's a broader picture where we have kind of had all, around the world, we've had all these government institutions, I guess, that have kind of, assumed this expansion of population, or a certain, population curve, a certain amount of young people compared to old people, and they are becoming incompatible with reality. I personally don't think that there's any inherent, or there isn't very much inherent problem in shrinking working age population, or preponderance of older people possibly needing support in a society. I think those create issues that are not very, can be dealt with relatively easily, but they are incompatible with the systems that we have in place already. And of course, the first thing they're going to do is try to make the existing system work and just get themselves farther in the hole. But there's a couple other problems with rising taxes. Historically, rising taxes have tended to cause currency decline for a number of reasons. One is, there's sort of the economy slows down, so there's kind of an excess of money compared to the economy. The other thing is that the first thing that everyone does, when the economy slows down, the first thing they do is pressure the central bank to have an easier policy. You know, all these gears start turning, and to just kind of make a long story short, higher taxes tend to lead to declining currency value, which is exactly what happened in the 70s as well.
Mm. So the other thing I wanted to just, I really enjoyed this quote too. But this is back in, talking about the French experience, which just seems reading the quote in your latest letter, it was just so pertinent. One of the parts I really liked about what happened in France in the 1790s and is happening now. Here's the quote from the book that you're citing, Inflation in France, where it says, "It creates a class of debauched speculators, the most injurious class that a nation can harbor, more injurious indeed than professional criminals who the law recognizes and can throttle." I like that line because it made me think of GameStop. It made me think of crypto. It's fascinating to watch the speed at which, what Andrew Dixon White would refer to here as a class of debauched speculators.
Yeah.
I went on a walk the other 2 or 3 days ago, and I bought some Dogecoin about a month or two ago, and I didn't spend much, and then I sold it relatively quickly before it jumped. So please, no one take crypto investment advice from me in a hurry. But I worked out that if I had simply put, I had about 100K sitting in an equities account. If I'd put that on Dogecoin instead of what I did put on it, it's $900,000 windfall in the space of like 4 weeks. So it was a very sad and lonely walk as I walked home. I keep having these conversations with my wife about all the great things like we could have done if I'd followed the strategy. But can you just step us through a little bit about how the current fiscal and monetary environment is driving this debauched class of speculation and what the implications are?
Yeah, it's almost something that we've been living in for so long that we've all kind of gotten used to it. When you read these accounts from France, or actually, in the very first book ever written about monetary topics in the West, which was called De Moneta from the 14th century France, they say the same thing. You start messing with the coinage. In this case, reducing the silver in the coinage, you get this debauched class of speculators. The very first book that was ever written on the topic of money says the same thing. We've almost been steeped in it for so long, since 1970, that we don't even have that experience of stable money to compare to, where the currency is, it's and all the effects of this on the economy, and just it's just not there. And the way you make, it's the old American dream, right? You start a business that makes goods and services that people like, and you, by providing this benefit to all these happy customers, you become wealthy, right? Yeah. And that's when the Fortune 500 was the Fortune 100, that wealthiest people in America, was dominated by industrialists and people who invented hula hoops and stuff, instead of hedge fund guys, right? And so we've been so steeped in it for so long, we just kind of we've just forget about Dogecoin, but the whole idea of a housing bubble, right? It's just kind of the air we breathe now, right? We're just gonna take this thing and whamma jamma it and flip it, right? Back in the old days, a house was something that you would build with your own hands and give it to your grandchildren. Anyway.
And do you think that the 2008 experience basically taught people that the Fed will backstop it? I mean, is that kind of in the air we breathe now, that the speculative impulse, at least in, the banking system, is that it doesn't matter how much we inflate the bubble, there's no way the Fed's going to let it burn to the ground?
Yeah, there is a feeling of that. And an interesting talk with a friend in Europe, and this, the Europeans are not as the stock market is more of like it's more like a casino. It's more like we look at cryptocurrencies, right? It's not really inherent part of day-to-day life, because, for example, almost all the pensions are government pensions, and it's kind of like our social security system, it's a pay-as-you-go system, but it's kind of, amped up to cover the entire pension. And like an old-fashioned corporate defined benefit plan, but it's the state pay-as-you-go system. And so, they're not looking at their 401ks. They don't have 401ks. What they're concerned is, can the government make the payments for their pension? The whole thing, it's not just a little social security. It's the whole. Can you imagine their whole thing? So what do they care about? They care about the government bond market, right?
Yeah.
And if you see what's happened in Europe, right, it's all about the bond market. But here in the United States, we have all this stuff that is dependent on the stock market. Yeah. All these pension systems and retirements and personal accounts and all this stuff. So while they're, got everything, all their eyes fixed on the bond market, we have our eyes fixed on the stock market, because not just because, I don't know, it sucks to own stocks and see them go down, but there's so many institutions that we have that are dependent on that. I mean, these state pensions and stuff, they're underwater already. And if stocks simply went to their average valuation of the last 50 years, they would have to wave the white flag.
Sure. So does the party stop in the bond market when this, when it all comes to an end? Is that where it starts? Because there's just eventual, based on the size of US deficits, that there's just a refusal by the bond market to basically take on any more of that collateral.
People are kind of sensing that right now. Now it's kind of coming to that, just because we have these giant deficits, right? Who's on the buying side of this 15% of GDP, right? Who took down 15% of GDP in government bonds at today's prices? Yeah. Well, obviously the central bank did, but who else would, right? And that's people are sensing now that that's going to be a battleground. It isn't quite a battleground yet, but it's like the armies are teaming up on both sides, right? Because, and you can kind of see the logic of it. Guy in the, a private market government bond investor says, well, I want to make some money, 3% or whatever, kind of an average bond yield. Plus, you guys looking kind of, you can't get these double-digit deficits under control. You're kind of looking like a bad credit. So let's add a credit risk on there. Plus, central bank sure is printing a lot of money these days, so there's some inflation risk. So what does it add up to? Yeah, you could say 5%, 6%. Historically, in U.S. history, that's kind of what bondholders were paid when there were these concerns. It was average rate in the 1990s, right? And that was kind of a happy time. But the trauma that would take place if we were to pay bondholders a 6% yield would be so great that there's obviously many incentives not to go there. Not only for the kind of simple reasons, but because the government now has so much debt that they'd be paying out 6% of GDP just to make the interest payments, and that's about a third of total tax revenue. So now you guys, a third of total tax, and maybe 3 times what they are today. So, so that now we have this debt, which is, what is the debt, right? 4%, 5%, 6%, 8% of GDP, and then we're going to stack on 4% more on top of that to make the interest payments. And then then you're going to have to find bondholders on the other side of the table every year to take down this 10, 12% of GDP in new paper flushing out of the treasury. Yeah, it's going to be a battleground. And we already kind of know how it's going to work out. The central bank's going to buy the stuff. It has been buying this stuff, right? Yeah. So we kind of know what's going to work out. At least I think I know. That's kind of why I'm writing this letter.
Well, let's get into the meat of the letter, because I wanted to talk about the focus of this particular edition of the Polaris letter is on hyperinflation, and I've got a few notes here that I wanted to go through. The first thing that I liked, look, and there's something lovely you wrote here early in the letter where you said, I want to reach out to that much larger group of people who sense that maybe something is going on and maybe they should do something, but they're not sure what. I like that because I've got plenty of friends and family who, increasingly they don't want to sit next to me at family barbecues because I'm like, have you bought gold? Have you bought gold? My mother, she's got cash sitting around. I'm going, Mom, please. I said to my brothers, but I like how you say that, because I think there's just so many people who are just
Yes.
rolling along at the moment with no intimation of the slow train coming down the track. So let's talk hyperinflation. The first thing was where was the part that you said it's as simple as that? So first, how common it is. So 70 countries have had hyperinflation since 1980. 6 had it in 2020, including Argentina. And I think the definition that you go from one peak government institution, and there's obviously multiple ways that you could describe hyperinflation, but 100% CPI rise over 3 years, at which point accounting systems break down because, it's almost impossible to conduct a business if currency is moving all over the place. And then following that, we get societal breakdown. So the last couple of things here, you say first the currency falls in value, then prices rise in response. It's no more complicated than that. Take us through, for new listeners, sophisticated listeners, take us through your thinking around hyperinflation.
Yeah. People, they just hear, tend to hear just these kind of a few individual situations like Germany
Zimbabwe,
in the 1920s, like Zimbabwe. They probably guess that it's happened 6 or 7 times in the 20th century or something like that, because that's, you hear about 6 or 7 stories, right? But it's actually very common. That kind of, the $1 billion banknote kind of hyperinflation, where it's, you get
wheelbarrows of money,
where the prices go up 1,000 times in the space of 12 months. That is not so common, just because most places manage to bring it to a halt before then. But there's a wide range. I wanted to bring up this idea. We kind of say inflation, and we use the term hyperinflation, and then there are actually accounting standards for hyperinflation. And you could argue that we should have some intermediate steps in here, right? But that's what we have. We have this, we say inflation, then we say hyperinflation. And there's a whole series of accounting practices that kick in when you kind of raise the flag and say we're in hyperinflation. And this came about because you have these multinationals like Coca-Cola or Pfizer or Ford, who are in Peru or Chile or
Ecuador, Venezuela,
Poland or something like that, selling cars and selling Coke, and they say, we can't figure out profit and loss because the CPI is up 50%, right? We got this on the books and the old price. So anyway, so they wanted some accounting guidelines, and so it's just interesting coming out of real experience at what point they put that line. That point said where the old accounting rules is broken. We need some kind of new thing. And they kind of put their heads together and they decided it was 100% rise in CPI over 3 years, which is not really that much. No. It's about 28% a year, 27% a year, which works out to about 2% a month. So, it's not like, prices triple in a month, 2%. We've probably had 2% in the last month. So that's one way to think about it. And if you look at that measure of hyperinflation, if you take that definition, you find out that there are dozens and dozens of countries all over the world that have had that. Almost every country in Latin America, almost every country in Eastern Europe. And there's also kind of milder forms of inflation where it's just kind of like 15% every year. It's not, it's not 100% in 3 years, but there's even a class of countries below that where they just have this kind of chronic inflation. So the point is that it's very common, which means kind of, rationally that many governments get themselves into these situations, right?
Yeah.
Including the United States or the American colonies many times.
And just on that, as you say that, and I want you to keep going, that, you just said governments get themselves in the situation. This is a quote from you. I thought this was brilliant. you said for a long time, people thought, I'll go from here. You say the core element that causes hyperinflation is that the government is printing money to pay its bills. And then you say this: for a long time, people thought that this was so obviously a bad thing to do that only the sorriest governments would even consider it. Mm-hmm. And that struck me because this is like international contagion, isn't it? Like here in Australia, we've got a traditionally very conservative government that's just, we had a budget last week and it's just throwing money everywhere. But I like that line where you say that this was historically, everybody thought this was such a stupid thing to be doing that only the most, banana republic governments would do it.
Yeah. And there was even that line from the book about France too. They said the same thing in 1790. This is so stupid. We did this 70 years ago. It was a disaster. Everybody knows you do not do this. And they said, yeah, but we want to, Anyway.
Yeah, that's right. We need free stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's just obviously the wrong thing to do. So, so I should mention, so what does hyperinflation look like? I like to think of it from the outside, right? Not for there's one perspective from the person who's experiencing it, and another perspective from the person who's outside. Like we're outside of the hyperinflation in Venezuela, right? But we tend to say, oh, Venezuela, I don't know, they speak Spanish, so it doesn't really count. So common in Latin America that can't happen here. Well, I would say let's take Britain. Let's just take Britain. Germany used to be one of the most reliable currencies in the world for hundreds of years, and then it had hyperinflation in the 20s. Let's take Britain. What would Britain look like if it had a hyperinflation? Well, basically, it's real simple. The value, the first thing that happens, the driver is the value of the currency declines. Now, there might be a good reason why the value of the currency declines, because they're printing more and more of it, for example. But that's basically what you see, right? You see the exchange value of the currency declining. So let's just imagine British pound is now worth about $1.30. It goes to 1/10 of its present value. It goes to 13 cents, right? Well, obviously prices are going to have to go up in Britain, right? I mean, British worker goes from whatever it is, $30 an hour in US dollars to $3 an hour, right? Same guy, is just going to sit there and take that, right? Obviously, the price of gasoline is going to go up 10 times in Britain, and then things start to flow in from there. So now let's do it again, right? Let's go from 13 cents, it goes to 1 cent. British pound now worth $1.30 is 10 years from now, let's say, worth a penny, right? Well, it's just so obvious from the outside that, a car, an apartment, it's got to go up in price, right? 5 times, 10 times, 20 times, 100 times. It probably won't fully reflect the declining value. Price won't go up 130, price of gasoline will go up 130 times because that's a worldwide commodity, but price of a property won't go up 130 times because who wants to live there, right? But it's going to have to go up. So that's what hyperinflation looks like from the outside. The value of the currency goes from $1.30, let's say, to a penny. And this happens. The Japanese yen used to be worth the same as $1. Now it takes 120 of them or 110 of them to buy $1.
What is the fundamental driver of that hypothetical currency decline? Simply money printing?
Basically, yes. There's two aspects to it. One is what you might call a decline in demand, a revulsion, a panicking out of the currency, which can cause it to decline a lot, vastly out of proportion to the actual increase in the money supply. So let's say, they kind of get to the brink, right? People are going, what the heck's going on? And then they just go too far, right? The money supply increases. Everyone's kind of wringing their hands and stuff. Money supply increases 30%. And they say, okay, that's it. I'm out of here, right? Whatever they do, they buy gold, they move their assets to another country, they pick up and leave. I don't know, whatever they do, and the result of this is the currency falls, currency falls by 70%, falls to 30% of its original value. So it's out of proportion.
And is that being driven by forex markets? That's basically the global forex markets are picking up that panic. They're picking up the money printing, and then the forex markets are going to drive a currency decline.
Essentially, yes. So the point is that so the exchange rate, so the volume of the currency might go up 30%, which they got away with in the past. They did it last year, nothing bad happened. They do it again this year, and it was just more than a straw, but they took a step too far. So and if you look at internally, right, the price of foreign currencies goes up 200%. So they said, oh, it's that this is speculators, it's the markets, it's it's completely out of proportion to the actual increase in the money supply. But if that's all it was, if they stopped, so if they stopped printing money, they said, okay, that's it. Obviously, we went too far. We're going to stop, right? Then eventually, if the amount of money did not increase anymore, is fixed. Let's just hypothesize. Then the currency is not going to fall a lot. It just can't go to zero while the supply is flat. It'll go up and down, but it's not going to just implode, right? But what happens is now the currency is worth a lot less, right? It's only worth 1/3 of what it used to be. So they now, to finance their deficits and so forth, they got to print a lot more of it. And so it's this, they get into this cycle of increasing supply. And that is where you get these, 50 to 1, 100 to 1, 1,000 to 1. 1,000 to 1 means the currency is worth 1,000th of what it was before. 1,000 to 1 declines. Mexico, just to give you an idea, the value of the Mexican peso declined from, I think it was 28 to the dollar in 1980 to 2,400, or actually it's the other way around, 24 to the dollar to 2,800 in 1990. So it's about 100 to 1 decline. Most Americans weren't even aware of it. So that get an idea of, just to get the wheels in people's heads turning. What if the British pound went to 10 cents and then it went to 1 cent in the space of, let's say, 10 years, just exactly like happened to Mexico? What would that look like? So obviously, if you are investing in British assets, the bonds and the cash, the bank deposits, that went to worth a penny.
Yeah.
Right. And the stock market typically declines about 90% in these situations, which means, so if you get 100 to 1 decline in the currency and you get a 10 to 1, 90% decline, 10 to 1 decline in the stock market, that means the nominal value of the stock market goes up 10 times.
Yeah.
So you have to get in this, this funny mental state where you lose 90% on stocks while stocks go up 10 times.
Yeah,
right?
gotcha.
Very strange thing.
I wanted to ask you just on something Jim Rickards is big on, which I'd like your input on, is that he argues that the increase in the base money supply doesn't drive inflation. He believes that it's all to do with velocity of money. Can you give us your thoughts on that? Because he argues if money is just printed but sits on balance sheets, it doesn't actually drive inflation. It's all to do with velocity. You got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, velocity is simply the ratio of some measure of the money supply, let's say base money supply, and GDP. So, if money supply goes up, but GDP doesn't go up a lot, then just by definition the velocity goes down. So it doesn't really mean a whole lot. I don't like the focus on velocity. But you can certainly have large increases. I mean, let's just take a health, well, maybe that's not a good example, but you can have large increases in the amount of money without having the currency decline in value. So forget about velocity, forget about the CPI. Just think about the exchange, the foreign exchange rate, for example, of the currency. It's when the foreign exchange value of the currency goes down a lot, that's when you're in trouble. And obviously, at some point, if you keep increasing the supply, you're going to get that, right? So the question is, some of the steps in between. We've had a I didn't go into this a lot in the letter, but I did mention it. we've had a very unusual situation worldwide, because we basically, there was this long, funny cycle of bank regulation. So a lot of the money in the economy is held in banks.
That's the Basel III stuff you mentioned, right?
It's Basel III stuff. So in the 50s, banks held about 10 cents for every dollar of deposits. So, there's $1 in your bank account, and they would loan out 90 cents, and they'd keep 10 cents just in case, because you might come to the window and say, hey, I want some money back. And they'd have to use that 10 cents and to give it to you, right? And basically through a lot of, the problem is they didn't make any money on that 10 cents. So, the bankers all say, well, if I could loan out this 10 cents, I'd make some more money. And so over a period of 40 years, they figured out how to get that down and down and down and down and down and down. So they got it. I don't actually remember what the figure was, but it was well under 1 cent for every dollar of deposits, because they could go to the money market and borrow. So they say, well, if this guy shows up and wants his money back, we don't have any money, but I can borrow it.
We can get it
immediately, if necessary, from the Fed itself. You can borrow it. So that allowed them to maximize the profitability. Well, that blew up in everyone's face in 2008. And what banks had to do, because they all wouldn't loan to each other because they all thought they were going to go bust. So that system went up in flames. So they had to borrow from the Fed.
Yeah.
And that was, even if you remember that process, where there's huge, like, trillions of dollars of discount lending, which is direct lending to banks from the Fed.
Discount window.
Yeah. And then they said, they stuck around the table, all the big bankers say, I'm not going to trust you guys for a long time. So obviously we're going to be in the situation for a while. Let's just write it into regulation, which they did in 2010. That was Basel III. And they phased it in 2019. So they created this regulatory framework where they said, we're going to go back to the 50s. We're going to carry 10 cents for every dollar of deposits, or basically is what it was. And that's what they did. Well, that 10 cents didn't exist. So the central banks had to create it, which is exactly what they did with the initial panicky discount window lending, but they just sort of formalized the process and they phased it all in. So the base money supply increased enormously. It basically went back to a 1950s level because they instituted this 1950 style regulation. And in the 50s, it was actually regulated. They were required to keep 10 cents. And that kind of fooled everybody, because they saw all this money being printed, metaphorically printed. It actually is a digital account, but it's almost the same thing. They say, all of our economic theory is wrong and all this stuff. And in fact, that the value of the dollar did decline. It was about $850 per ounce of gold, and then it declined to about 1,800 today. So it wasn't entirely harmless. But there was no kind of, a lot of economic theory was this monetary theory, which has always been wrong, but it just, the wrongness of it displayed itself because the percentage increase in the amount of money was so completely out of whack with the percentage increase in CPI or nominal GDP or some other thing. Well, what happened was, even at the end of 2019, there was a substantial. The 2019, the agreement they signed into law in 2010 was fully implemented, and the banks were required to have this 10 cents. And they were still short of money. There was still only 8 cents in the system, and they had to scramble around at the end of 2019 to kind of make the regulatory hurdles. So there was even a shortage then. And then there was this in 2020, there was again this huge expansion in money supply. And to make a long story short, it appears that by the end of 2020, two things had happened. One is they filled in that prior 2019 deficit, the lack of money. And then the other thing that happened was banks made a lot more loans. Remember all those loans they're making?
Yeah.
All those, so because they're making more loans, they had to have more cash, right? Just because of the rules. For every 90 cents of loans, you need 10 cents of cash. So they had to raise the cash for that too. So to kind of summarize this complex topic, by the end of 2020, it looks like, that whole thing was done, right?
Yeah.
Banks had plenty of cash, but it was not obviously way too much. And the dollar had fallen somewhat in value. We had that big move from 2018 to 2020, $1,300 per ounce of gold to $1,800 or so. But it wasn't a hyperinflationary blowout. And in all the chaos, it was kind of not a big deal. And so that's kind of why I raised the hyperinflation flag today instead of some years ago, is because we don't have the banks sucking up the money anymore. Arguably, well, we're going to have to kind of see what happens, but they seem to be completely topped up at the moment, which the government seems to have all discipline and say, look, we proved over 10 years that you could just print money like crazy and woohoo Yahoo. Right now they're going to be dumping more money than ever before on the economy through the central bank printing press, and there's really no good reason for it.
So, and is it also true that the primary dealers are getting paid interest on those reserves too? So now that they're all capitalized, like they're getting paid. I mean, is it safe to say they're just being paid? They're paid interest on excess reserves, so they're being paid interest on funny money that wasn't productively created by anybody, right?
They are, yeah. They are being paid interest on those reserves, which is another kind of new thing, and it might play a big role going forward. It completely changes the banking dynamic, because if you increase the money paid on the reserves become more attractive, right? You can make 3%, no risk, with these bank, cash payments held at the central bank, which didn't exist before 2009 in all of U.S. history.
Then the Fed has to print to pay those interest.
Well, not exactly. It's making interest income from its government bonds,
right? Okay.
But the interesting point is, if they're making the interest income on the government bonds, but they're paying it out on the reserves, then then those bonds become, how would I explain this? How can I explain this in words? Basically, the Treasury has to make those payments. Before, when they weren't paying interest on reserves, the Federal Reserve would, theoretically, that's what they say. I don't really believe them, but the story is they take the interest income from their government bonds and they give it back to the Treasury. So it's as if they didn't pay anything interest at all. Well, a bond where you don't pay any interest is kind of a lot like a bond that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Hey, we threw it down a hole and it disappeared because we're paying them interest, and then they give us the interest back, and it never matures, right? Because they keep rolling them over. So that's kind of the money printing process. But now, if they're taking that interest income and they're paying out to banks, then it's not coming back to the Treasury. So those bonds kind of exist again.
I just have this image in my mind of walking down Main Street, USA, and saying to the average American citizen something like, those banks that almost blew up the world in 2008, well, now they've got vast amounts of funny money which they're being paid interest on. I just think that would be an interesting, because it just seems that it's almost no one knows about this, right? I mean, you just don't hear it talked about a great deal.
Well, one of the things is no one knows what to say about it, because even the Wall Street guys who are actually, show up to work each day to think about this, not sure what to make of it. I have kind of my opinion, which I described in this Basel III story and all this stuff, and kind of my way of making sense of it all. But it's a pretty weird situation, and it's hard to come to a conclusion. You talk to some other guy who's also supposed to be some big monetary expert, they come up with some completely different kind of thing.
If I've learned one thing,
I think I'm right, and I think they're wrong, but I can understand why people are confused.
If I've learned one thing in my journey in macro, and as many listeners would know, I started from scratch about a year or 18 months ago.
That's the best way to start.
Yeah, well, I just if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that just for every strong case for something, somebody else has a strong case in the opposite direction. It's extraordinary, isn't it? I'd love to get us as close to the truth as possible, because there's just someone has to be right eventually.
So I can having been involved in this space for 25 years or so, I can tell you where some of the pitfalls are, but one, to not start that discussion because it would take a week. One thing I've learned is that, academic economists, most of the people get paid to do economics are academics.
Yeah.
And as we know from all the academic studies, but it's particularly true in economics, a lot of it's dogma. It's kind of like the dogma of the church, which has some basis in reality, but it's also a lot of nonsense, which exists because of this institutional a need for it, or an institutional need for homogeneity, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And there's just the most horrendous idiot nonsense that just persists for year after year from the academic economists because it's dogma.
Yeah, well, it's like your quote about the MMT stuff. It's just like, I think you captured it beautifully. It's a wonderful excuse to print money, and it's a great idea until it's it's very popular until it's not. Listening to you, I've got you might appreciate this. This has been my my go-to recently. Thomas Sowell's.
Oh,
basically.
I
like him.
He's good.
He's just such a straight shooter, and he's just outside the tent because he was a Marxist, and then obviously he's African American, and he just writes so simply and beautifully. And listen, a couple of key things I wanted to ask you as we wrap up. Reading Dan Oliver's letter today, something resonated with what you're talking about. He said that it's not necessarily money printing or the scale of base money that's necessarily bad, if what's backing it up, if the collateral is of high quality. And he starts off talking about, as you talk about, it was originally backed by gold, but he said that where we're heading is that the collateral backing up the currency is just getting worse and worse. Is that accurate?
I probably wouldn't put it in those terms. I think that's a little bit metaphorical, but ultimately the collateral, so to speak, backing a currency is the institution. What are the people in charge going to do? What are their ideas? What are their thinking process? What are their political pressures? For a long time, United States had a gold standard policy and a pretty good record of maintaining it. That was your guarantee. Then they had, since 1970, we've had a floating fiat currency, but one that has been better than almost all the others. Although the dollar today, I think, is worth about 1/50th of what it was worth in 1960. It beats, nevertheless, losing 90%, 98% of your value beats almost all the competitors. But now the backing, so to speak, behind our currency is the actions of the people involved, and it's pretty goofy. I think people just it's going to come to tell you how these things kind of develop. I've seen a lot of currency breakdown moments. What typically happens is there's a breakdown, right? Currency drops 20%, I don't know, something like that. And then everyone watches to see what the government and central bank does. And that's the moment, right? They either get their act together, they do something effective to fix the problem, or they flail around like idiots, or they make the problem worse, or throw gasoline on the fire, or whatever they do. That's the moment, right? And that's the point at which you lose 20% and you recover 10%, and so you've only lost 10%. It's not a big deal. Or you lose 20% and you look at them, you say, you know what, these guys are idiots. Let's get the heck out of here. And in fact, why don't we just short it in huge size? And then it drops 80%. Right.
So look, I mean,
and the money supply hasn't really changed, right?
Yeah.
2 weeks have gone by, money supply is the same, but That's
Well,
the moment.
This is a really important point. I think you capture it beautifully in how you express it there. There will come a moment when the house of cards begins to topple and you say, well, you know, everybody's watching to look at what they can do.
Yeah.
Let's come back to our Japanese finance minister in 1936. Like, it seems to me that the obvious thing is to put your hand up and say, we have vast, you know, future funded things that we can't pay for. We've developed a system of vast transfer payments. It's utterly unsustainable, and we have to cut spending by 40% next Tuesday. Like, I mean, that fixes it, but you get complete social breakdown. So when you say everyone's looking at what they can do, apart from massively cutting spending, what can they do?
I think people are a lot more resilient than governments give them credit for. I think if you can make big changes, and if it's pretty clear that the outcome is a positive one, then people will tolerate it. I think I would like to look more into the details of Zimbabwe, because I was actually involved there for a while, and I should know more about it than I do.
Yeah.
But I think one of the problems there is they got into this pattern where 30% of the entire working population worked for the government.
Yeah.
Obviously, not all of them did something useful. And of course, not very surprisingly, they ended up with fighting fiscal problems, and so they ended up printing money. And obviously, the solution was to fire about 75% of those people. And I think, you know, moves like that, if they can see the problem and see the solution, you know what, we're just going to have to get rid of 75% of the people, right? Because there's no real reason for them to be there. Then people will kind of accept that, and so that's not such a big deal. But we're not, and I think we will get to that point in the United States when we have to, right? But we're not at that point yet, and that's how governments get into these hyperinflationary situations. Just as I said in France in 1790, right? They had some problems; they could have been fixed, but today it seems like it's so much easier just to print the money.
100%.
Right?
Oh, it's funny. I was in Zimbabwe in 95 and spent a lot of time there in 95, and before it got really bad. And it's interesting you say that, because I remember seeing so many government employed kind of security guards, you know, they're just on every corner. And like you say, there was just so many people drinking from the government trough. And, you know, I live in a government town here in the capital city here in Australia. And it's just, there's the expansion in the public sector has been quite extraordinary. And I'm just hoping none of my friends listen to this episode and hear me talking like that, because, you know, interesting. I caught up with an executive yesterday, and she was telling me a story about a friend who had been in private enterprise and went into the public sector, into what's called the Australian Digital Transformation Office. So this government body was responsible for, you know, creating a wonderful new digital future. And this guy said to the person I was talking to, they said he was there for 2 years. 2 years in the digital transformation office, and he was losing his mind, because he said they were 2 years in and nothing had happened. Like nothing. Like he just said, I can't do this. I can't keep going in there every day. Now, I know there's many great people maybe listening who work in the public sector and do a great job, but I often think of what would happen if we had a much smaller public sector and this vast number of people were forced into the private economy, and all that energy and capacity and insight, you know, would just be unleashed in a productive economy. End of sermon from me. Look, I want to ask you a couple last things. I just about to finish Jordan Peterson's new book, which is quite good. And I was on another walk and I listened to his interview with a guy, Professor Tooney, I think it's spelled Tuny, who's from he's attached to the Cato Institute, but he's also with an interesting website called Human Progress, or globalprogress.com. And they do an extensive data set. I think they've got 2,000 data sets on their website showing how the world is getting better and better and better. And it's a really interesting interview, and I'll put in the show notes because it's worth watching. And yeah, it's fascinating. Things like absolute poverty has gone through the floor. I think when Reagan took office, it was hovering still globally around 50% or 40%. Now it's down to, something like 10%. It's just, there's all these indicators that are really positive. And as I was listening to it, I thought the world in some measure seems to be getting a lot better. There's less war, there's better health, child mortalities, infant mortality is better. The environment's actually being looked after in many positive, all these sorts of things. So if that data is true, and how do we reconcile this conversation we're having with that? And you know what I mean? Like, if the world's getting better, is it simply that we're on a sort of fourth turning precipice and we are heading for some debt-fueled global conflagration? Do you think the world is getting better, or are we really heading for something profound?
Well, the world for the most part has gotten better, but the world is those five. Developed world's about 1 billion people. There's 8 billion people in the world. There's the first tier of developing economies, which has expanded enormously, China and to some degree India, and also the other places in Asia and much of Latin America. Much of Latin America was quite prosperous in the 50s and 60s, but then they had this just absolute disaster in the 80s, hyperinflation throughout the continent. And hyperinflations end when people starve.
Yeah.
It's real bad. So that kind of raised all those things. Africa, for example, Africa was under British rule, and it was kind of prosperous in a colonial way. And then they handed all these countries to their local people, and they were independent, and they didn't have any history of modern government. So a lot of them went communist, because that was just that if you just,
it was the vibe.
Because actually a lot of tribal societies are sort of semi-communist, sort of semi-socialist, because anyway, so but it doesn't scale up, as we know, right? Every nuclear family is communist, but then you can't scale that up. So there was all this disasters in Africa because it was kind of the all these issues. Communist sort of issues, and there's been a lot of success in Africa recently in the last 20 years. Hearing about Botswana and Tanzania and so forth have kind of figured out this capitalism thing, and they're generating some positive stuff. So
it's a younger population too.
Yeah, so in the 50s, you had this billion people or less, 500 million people of the developed world. And then it was kind of dark everywhere else, right? There was nothing going on in Asia. Places like Malaysia and Thailand were just, subsistence rice agriculture. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have, automobiles. It was water buffalo and stoop labor. And so, things have gotten a lot better that way. But that's the world. It's the bottom half that's gotten a lot better. But us in the first world, I think, it's kind of a mixed bag. It's the fourth turning for us. Well, what the result will be in Kenya or Nigeria, which Nigeria now has a population of something like 80 million people. I don't know. I'm not sure. Right? It's kind of a whole different cycle.
Yeah, it's I think I might have mentioned this to you in our last discussion. Ross Douthat's new book, The Decadent Society, is very, very good on this. I mean, he's known as the only conservative person on the entire staff of the New York Times, but his latest book's very good on this. And his concept of decadence isn't so much around profligate pleasure, but running out of energy, in the sense of he argues that that the first world sort of thrived on exploration, and you look at the US and the space program, and he said that part of the problem is we've run out of frontiers, we've run out of a spark to drive us forward. So you sort of see a comfortable, almost enervated first world culture that doesn't have much to strive towards.
Yeah, so, we could I don't know how much time we have left, but as you know, that's another interesting topic of mine, which I call the end of heroic materialism.
Yeah.
And there was a wonderful 1969 BBC documentary. It's like a 13-part series called Civilization, hosted by Kenneth Clark. It's very famous.
It is famous.
Even now, you go back and watch it on Netflix because it's really worthwhile. And Kenneth Clark entitled the last episode "Heroic Materialism," and it's basically from the Industrial Revolution forward. 1780s,
the
1820s, the first whole up to the present day, and this is the time when we didn't build cathedrals, we built suspension bridges.
Yeah.
Right. There were enormous advances during that time, but it's done. We don't need any more suspension bridges. We don't need better suspension bridges. We did it. So now we're running out of ideas, right? First you build a suspension bridge, and then you build another suspension bridge, and then you build a better suspension bridge, and then you need some new ideas. And that's where we are, essentially. We've done that, right? And so but at the other hand, there's so many aspects of society which are just catastrophically bad, like the visual arts.
Yeah.
Go to any contemporary art museum. It's either metaphorical vomit or it's literal vomit.
Yeah.
Right. All these human civilizations in the past had no problem painting pretty pictures. No difficulty with that. So that's the reason we can't do it. One example. One of my big focuses has been what I call urban design, city design. You go to all these pre-1900 and even pre-1800 cities, whether it be Kyoto or it's Lyon, France, or it's Santorini, Greece, or Athens, or something like that. They're all beautiful, and they're all beautiful kind of in the same way, even though they're vastly different cultures, right?
Yeah.
But for some reason, even though they used to have to stack bricks by hand. And you know how hard it is to make concrete if you don't have a concrete factory and you have to build it with a charcoal fire? I looked into the Roman recipe for concrete. It's pretty tough. It was so difficult to build things, but they built such beautiful things, and they lasted for thousands of years.
Yeah.
And we have every advantage, but we just build the most horrendous crap, and we tear it down in 20 years because we can't stand the sight of it anymore. And we want to build some more horrendous crap. And we all know this. We've been complaining about it for a long time. But I think that's, we got to stop building suspension bridges, make a nice neighborhood.
Yeah.
And when people change their focus, they're going to realize, first of all, just making one nice neighborhood, just a nice place to live, is as difficult for us as making a suspension bridge was in 1850. Super difficult.
Yeah, I hear you.
And then once someone finally does it, it'll be like this amazing mind-bending breakthrough. Even the French can't do it. Even the Greeks can't do it, right? They have their old towns, but they can't build new ones. It's going to be this mind-bending breakthrough, and they're going to do it again, and they're going to make a better one. And we'll spend 200 years getting back to where we were in 1800. So the funny thing is, all those cities, Athens or Paris, at the beginning of the heroic materialist age in 1800, they had beautiful buildings, but everything else was horrible. They had horrible sewage. They had horrible water quality. They had horrible air quality. There were animals dying in the streets. People threw trash out of their windows. There was disease everywhere. All these problems we solved. And now if we just combine the two, right, we can get their aesthetic sense with our civic, our plumbing and, sanitation. We'll have something new that had never been created before. It'll be great.
I used to have a Latin statement on my email signature, Pulchritudine salvabitur mundus, which is from Dostoevsky, which was, the world will be saved by beauty. And it's I think that as a cultural crying out for it, even if it's it's that transcendental need for truth, beauty, and goodness, right? That you could apply it to anything. I look at the shadow banking system, and it's not pretty. It's ugly. It's deception is by its nature ugly. Stealing is by its nature ugly. So maybe beauty is the new frontier in a whole lot of areas.
Let's finish up. Last thing was you write in the letter some great stuff just on strategy, and this is basically some gold bullion, some silver if you can, and you write some great stuff on some of the mining companies. So can you give us a quick summary for people listening on if we're going to get a hyperinflationary event, what are smart people going to do?
Yeah, I mean, this is not for the silver stackers that have been doing this for 10 years because you kind of know the story. But there's so many people out there, and not just people, but giant institutions and pension funds and everybody. That's why I start the letter with everybody owns all the assets. So if you want to know what everyone owns, just look at all the assets.
Yeah.
Everybody's got these 60-40 stock portfolios.
Yeah.
Stock and bond portfolios. And let me, I just took the example. Just think about Britain. British pound goes from $1.30 to a penny. How's the British stock market going to do in US dollars? Probably going to get, pulverized. How's the British bond market going to do in US dollars? Well, it's going to vaporize. It's going to disappear completely. So, it's hard to predict the future. But you have to have something in your portfolio that's going to withstand an event like that. And historically, the go-to asset has always been gold bullion. When Roman families, even today, they dig up these hoards of coins in Italy that was left by some Roman family that the family's gone. They never dug it up themselves. Who knows what happened to those guys? Coins are still there, but why do they do that, right? Why do you take money and bury it in the ground? It's because all of their other assets, their cows and their real estate, their banks in Rome and their banks, all that stuff got blown away, right? That's what, the gold is what lasted. So for thousands of years, humans have kind of known this, that gold and silver is much more volatile now, but it wasn't so volatile in the past, are the things that will definitely make it to the other side.
Yeah.
And then from there, you can get more sophisticated, but you have to have something. And some just think about an allocation, how much of your portfolio you want to put in stuff that will survive A, and B, potentially benefit from a major currency event. You just pick an allocation, 5%, 10%, 20%, 30%, maybe 50%.
Yeah. So let me ask you, my thesis is simply this, and, having studied crypto economics at Oxford, I'm like, I think there's no way in hell that sovereign governments and central banks are going to let individual cryptos win. Because if they do, the world as we know it's over. I mean, if seigniorage is gone, all of that stuff's gone. I just, whether they regulate it to death or they outlaw it. So, in a world of highly likely central bank digital currencies, can you see a hyperinflationary collapse leading to the reestablishment of a gold standard? Because a critique would be gold is done, gold is over. We're going to have CBDCs. They're going to build some new clever blockchain-based system. Do you still, in your heart of hearts, see an emerging gold standard at some point in the future?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of scenarios and theories. People say, well, we're just going to go to the new world order and there'll just be one global currency of tyranny, whatever.
Currency of tyranny, I like that.
Yeah, but historically, what has happened is, just imagine historically what has happened is things blow up and then they go back, then they go to gold. Even Mao Zedong in China, communist guy, the nationalist government during the Civil War, the 40s, hyperinflated the currency. Even that guy went to gold. Because what are you going to do, right? Everything's up in flames. All the politicians lie all day, which I had the example of Rudy Haverstein in Germany, right? They tell all these lies. What are you going to do? Oh, we're just going to have other government people run the currency.
That's right. You can trust these guys. Here's some new ones we've got.
Guys. We picked them. We handpicked them.
Yeah. The other guys are terrible, but these guys
I'm going to trust the stupid metal, and I don't trust you guys at all, right? Metal's always worked. So that, they tend to want to say we're going to get the human element out of the currency. And that, and then gold is the alternative.
Yeah.
You have to remember, in the when the U.S. Constitution was written in late 1780s, there had been a hyperinflation. The previous government, the Continental Congress, printed money to pay its bills and blew the currency away into confetti. And that was actually after 100 years of all the state governments, basically the colonial governments, the colonies, basically doing the same thing repeatedly, over and over again. They'd pay their soldiers in paper currency and they would lose, blah, blah, blah. And so they actually wrote into the Constitution, it's in there in Article 1, Section 10, I guess, only gold and silver coins shall be legal tender in all transactions. Now, it never actually happened. There were paper currencies in the United States from the beginning, but they were private. But they were so serious about it, they said, we just want metal coins.
Yeah.
That's these people, the same people who had hyperinflated the currency, who had 100 years of paper currencies. They said, nope, we're going to kick the habit. And that's what tends to happen. That's what happens.
And just on that, I think it was George Washington who made the point that it was utterly reprehensible for any government to create, debt that couldn't be paid off in its own lifetime. The idea was that to ship that to future generations, Washington thought was the most, the worst thing government could do. And now that is just the Kool-Aid, right?
Yeah. One of the things we have to figure out some solution to this, because you can't just have a, constitutional amendment says balanced budget amendment, because what happens when you have a war, right? But it'd be nice if we can work out some way to put a lid on this.
But it's fundamentally a moral question, right? Like fundamentally, I mean, I guess it's hard now because the spending commitments are so extreme that the essence of political economy is that any politician knows that he goes to an election with an austerity platform. But that goes to the morality of the people, right? Like a moral populace will vote. This is back to Jude Wininsky's take on political economy, that really politicians, the best politicians, are the ones that present to the electorate what the electorate actually wants, which was counterintuitive for me, because I always thought that basically politicians were essentially salespeople who just came up with ideas and had to sell them. But Wininsky's take is different, is that really like I said, the best politicians figure out what the populace is trying to tell them. So I guess at the root of it, if you don't have a moral populace, people that kind of think, what, I didn't work for this payment, I don't deserve this payment, I need to go and work harder to get what I want. I mean, how do you change it without that kind of dynamic, ultimately?
Yeah. At some point, you have to, all the founders say, one reason we can get away with this utopian system, right? The Constitution was, by the standards of its time, kind of like this crazy dream, is because of the morality, the high morality of the American people. And they said right out, you can't just do this anywhere. And we've seen, it just hasn't worked in Latin America, for example. They just screw it up once a generation. But kind of getting to your questions, I spend, I'm from a kind of, when I put my policy hat on rather than sort of my investing and hat, dealing with current events, investing, but kind of go a little ways down the way. At this time, the house is already on fire. You're not going to change anyone's minds. Everything's kind of going into historical inevitable, not quite inevitable, but consequences, historical consequences. But I tend to focus, and that's what almost everyone's focused on. 95% of people analyzing this current event. But I like to think about the next step. Okay, then what? Everything goes to hell. Then what? And I think it's good to have a plan for that time, so you don't end up with communism. And my plan is very simple. It's basically the magic formula. It's actually the reason I wrote that book. was to give a plan for the period that comes afterwards, as to say, well, in the United States, for example, let's go back to the original federal model, what it actually is written in the Constitution, which is federal government has certain roles, and that's it. It's limited government. It's limited to these certain roles, and that's it. And the roles are basically the military and foreign affairs, trade, immigration, foreign policy, and it's a pretty small. It's a pretty by that time, a lot of these liabilities are gone. Right, Social Security, the debt, it's all been inflated into oblivion. And so everything. All you do is you write into writing. Just have a omnibus bill that you pass in Congress, which will be whatever. I don't know, who knows what the political parties will be, but it'll be a conservative party. You just say, we're going to, all that stuff, all that Great Society stuff, all that welfare stuff, Social Security, Medicare, blah, 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 gone. As of tomorrow, we cancel all the programs, which then puts the responsibility on the state. So they don't necessarily disappear entirely, but then the states do it, which is the original design of the Constitution. And then once you've done that, you've just slashed spending by 80%. So what happens? You don't have to print money anymore because you don't need the money, right? And then you can have a major reform of taxes because your demands are much smaller. So you implement whatever it is, 8% federal VAT, no more income taxes, no more payroll taxes. Just, I prefer VAT, but it could be a national sales tax or something like that.
And that massively stimulates productive activity, right?
Yes. And so, I kind of wonder, what's the political process to get there? We've already seen this happen. So there was hyperinflation in both Germany and Japan in the late 1940s, both under US occupation, right? The military had already taken over. So they were kind of running the show. And they were printing money to fund the governments. And so the first thing they did is they came in and they passed the law, no more deficit spending. In law, black letter law. You have to get the money in the bank account before you spend it.
It's not complex.
It's not complex. Both Germany and Japan did that. And so once you did that, the pressure on the central bank to print the money was gone because they didn't spend the money until they got the money. In fact, Napoleon did the same thing when he came to France in 1799. So once the central bank was freed from that political pressure, the next step is they went to the gold standard.
Yeah.
Or in indirect gold standard, they pegged the currencies to the dollar. So that is, and then the next thing that both Germany and Japan did is they had huge tax reforms where tax rates came down dramatically. By the standards of the time, I think we should just have a big reform where you just get rid of everything and just have something like a federal VAT. And so, this is not just a daydream, it's how it's actually happened in Germany and Japan and France, arguably Napoleon, to some degree in China. So it's not silly. So if you just have that, I think when the time comes, you're going to have a plan. I like to say, everyone's frustrated because they've been talking for decades about all these wonderful sort of conservative small government themed ideas that have no political reality. But when the time comes, you're going to have a solution. You're not going to have decades to talk about it anymore.
Sure.
You're just going to have to do it.
I have a strong feeling that it probably is not going to be a very long time before we find out. And
yeah.
Well, I want to thank you as always for your time. I love these conversations, and I get to listen to them again. I listened to them several times, but I want to encourage everybody to check out the Polaris letter on Substack and just go to Substack, get behind what Nathan's doing. It's just I love reading it. I laugh, I learn. I really do. You got a great way of writing. It's rare to be able to synthesize complex ideas and make them interesting and amusing at the same time. So otherwise, New World Economics, people can still find you there, newworldeconomics.com. But Mr. Nathan Lewis, thank you so much for joining us again on the Supply Side Podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
We'll do it again soon.